Everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, AI and Human Ingenuity, Powerful Weapons Against Risk. I know that we have a lot of people joining us from different parts of the world, so we're going to give you some time to get into this session with us. In the meantime, I'm your moderator, Ladanna James, and I'm joined by a fantastic panel this afternoon. I'll introduce you to them in a little while. But before we do that, let us get some housekeeping items out of the way, so people can, join us along the way before we delve into things more deeply. So first and foremost, this is a conversation. It's going to be an engaging conversation. It can get passionate at times. I think it will, but we are going to try and restrain ourselves a little bit so that we can field your questions. So if you are joining us and you've got, a burning question that you want one of our panelists to address, please go ahead and put that question into the chat box. Our helper here today, Danny, is going to be fielding those questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. The other thing to note is that we are recording this, so you will have an opportunity to listen to this on demand. In case you missed something as part of the conversation we were going to quickly, we definitely will be making it available to you afterwards. And we're encouraging you to share it widely. If you found something engaging here and you found it of value, please share it with your teams, share it with your colleagues, share it with your networks. And the other thing that we want to mention to you is that we're thinking of doing this, considering this as one in a series of conversations. So that the whole issue around reputation risk is just so interesting and deep, and there's so much fodder, and there's always something going on in the news, and so we definitely want to keep this conversation going. So keep your eyes and ears peeled. We are definitely going to be sending out more information about that. I know that we still have people joining, so we don't want to get too far into this conversation. We want to give them a minute to jump in. The other thing that I will mention is that we want this to be fairly interactive in the sense that we've got some polls that we have for you. So please do participate. We're not going to do anything else with those polls other than to get, a baseline and some understanding of where you are in terms of reputation risk within your organization. So I think we're going to get started and jump in. So let's level set here as people continue to join. So why are we here? So again, AI and human ingenuity, powerful weapons against risk. And the panel is going to be examining the life cycle of the kinds of risks that business stakeholders pose to you and your organization. So be they employees, be they vendors or suppliers, partners, whoever they are, any business stakeholder can come with a certain amount of risk. So we are going to be examining the whole life cycle of that. We're going to understand the increased complexity of risk detection and the role that AI can play in gathering intelligence. We're going to learn how integrating tools can help you better detect, prevent, and respond to incidents. And we're going to learn why continuous monitoring of online news is becoming more and more important every day, as I'm sure most of you joining us can attest. So that's why we're here. So let's introduce you to our panel. They're fantastic. They're going to be giving you lots to think about today. So let's start with Mark. Hi, Mark. So Mark is an independent security consultant who worked for nearly 35 years as a federal law enforcement agent. So he's had an illustrious career. And at the conclusion of his federal service, he was director of the United States Secret Service. So needless to say, Mark has seen a lot, heard a lot, done a lot. And his ability to detect, assess, and analyze threats is second to none. So his perspective is going to be invaluable to this conversation. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much, Ladanna. Nice to be here.
And then we have Don over there on our screen. Don is president of Interfor International, and he drives day-to-day operations as well as leads Interfor's global investigations and security consulting divisions. Prior to Interfor, Don was the head of global security and investigations for a Fortune 500 technology company. Welcome, Don.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
And then we have Alex Aoun. So Alex is co-founder and chief product officer with Valital Technologies. So Valital is an AI-powered software that scours online news, blogs, and some social media platforms to flag business stakeholders who might be involved in some misconduct activities, including fraud, harassment, abuse, violence, among other things. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks, Ladanna. Great to be here.
So as we said, when we sent out the invitations, that we're going to really base this conversation on real world case studies, and we're going to delve into those. But we wanted to sort of hear from the panelists. Why is it so important that we're talking about, blending human intelligence and artificial intelligence to get the best results when it comes to risk management? So why don't we start with you, Mark, briefly? Just why is this so important that we're combining the two things?
Thank you, Ladanna. Well, I think primarily because, there's just so much information out there. It's just not humanly possible for, 10 people to comb through all of the information that may be coming into one organization. And with technology, with data aggregation, when it comes to the volume of information, it is just, you need something, some platform that can digest all this information, analyze all this information, and distill it into a program where you can give that to to your decision makers and allow them to use their experience, their background, their knowledge to make the best possible decision, whether they have 5 minutes to make that decision or 5 days. This combination of technology and human is going to help you with your risk management program and get you the best result.
So Alex, what would you say to that?
Yes, definitely. In terms of what Mark said, and maybe to add on, coming from the technology side, using technology alone is a piece of the puzzle. So it will never be the full picture. And even you'll never see one technology being used. You need probably to use several technology based on to get really the full picture of what you're looking for. And technology will help you really filter the information. When we talk about AI, is really to look at certain patterns that are repetitive, that humans may take time just to go and find the same result all over again. So being able to leverage AI to avoid that step and not have any human intervention on that will definitely help and use the human judgment at the end of the day. Because we often say that AI doesn't replace the judgment, doesn't replace the thorough analysis. You need people like Mark, like Don, to go further and deeper in some research. But that initial step of filtering the information, gathering an analysis, which may be redundant and take a lot of time, is where technology can come and help.
Fantastic. So Don, what would you add to that?
Well, first of all, welcome to all our friends, colleagues, and associates around the world. It's great to spend this time with you. I would agree with both Mark and with Alex. Quite frankly, AI is a powerful, powerful tool. It's getting more powerful every day and every month and every year, but it has its limitations. And so it's critical to understand from a security and investigative standpoint that no one system is perfect. And so we can't use just one. It needs to be a layered approach. And unfortunately, in the security world, we all know as professionals that we have to be right and accurate every single time. However, the bad guys need to be right or successful only once to prove their point. So there needs to be a layered approach. It needs to be a combination of human instincts, human ingenuity, human intelligence, and our ability to sift through data using and leveraging strong AI tools. So they work together to be perfect.
No, that's great. And I think that gives us, that that's the right point to sort of get a baseline for how people in the audience are viewing all of these various risks that we're going to be talking about. So I think, Danny, this is the point where we put up our first poll so that people can be part of this conversation. So what are some risks your organization is primarily concerned about mitigating? So you've got multiple choice here. So we'll give you a second to answer that question. What are some risks your organization is primarily concerned about mitigating? So as you click the right buttons for you, I think we'll get a sense of how your vote turns out. Danny? Oh, that's really quite interesting.
Cyber threats seem to be the leading.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very
Second to that
much.
is reputational, so that's very interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So thank you very much. We'll have a few more of these polls as we continue our conversation. So as we said, we want to look at real world case studies, and there is no shortage of them in the news. And so in the first instance, we're going to look at a couple of cases from Canada. And they happened earlier this year. And in one instance, we have a young lady, who is a tax professional working in a large consulting firm here in Canada. From all that we understand of her, she was a good employee. She had no police records. There were no red flags, no online behavior that would make us think twice about her. But she was recently arrested with 4 others in what police called a major drug bust operation. And in another instance, here in Canada again, a young financial advisor for one of our large financial services firm was caught carrying a large cache of prohibited handguns that was destined for the US. Again, no red flags, good employee, well liked as far as we understand, and no obvious online behavior to flag. So what's particularly difficult for the employers in these cases is that these people had client-facing roles, and within financial institutions that have a fiduciary responsibility to their customers. They handle large volumes of very sensitive information about their customers, and these employees had a certain amount of access to some of this information. So why don't we start with you here, Mark? Level set for us. I think many of us are so used to, if you can call it garden variety, bad behavior by employees. I think this shocks us a little bit that we're talking about, arms trafficking and drug running. But maybe it shouldn't. Talk to us about the risks to the organizations and the long-term ramifications of something like this.
Obviously very concerning. We're all familiar with the insider risk. Insider risk can do so much more damage to any organization at times because just because of how long it can go on without being detected. As you mentioned, on the surface, these seem to be exemplary employees, and yet one is running guns and the other one is trafficking in drugs. And what we don't know is what was that based on financial gain? Was that based on what was the end game for doing this? And the people that they were dealing with, did they give them any access to their organization? And if you're part of that company, you have to be asking yourself just what internal damage has been done, what external damage has been done to our clients, and you have to be asking yourself, how did this happen, right underneath our nose, and what do we have to do to be more vigilant? And are we just relying on a preliminary background investigation that we did on these employees when they first came on, whether it be 5 or 10, 15 years ago? Have we done anything in the meantime to ensure the integrity of our organization? So just a lot of concern there on a lot of levels, and very damaging to the reputation of the company, and the credibility that they're going to lose with their clients.
So Alex, I can imagine the day after being a colleague of one of these people, and you're waking up and this is what you're seeing on the news, and you're just in complete and utter shock. So, most of them found out the way that we would have found out, right, through the news. So as I mentioned, Valital, it's an AI powered software, scours for online news about misconduct. In this case, there wasn't anything to flag. But in these incidents, how would technology have helped these organizations? And what can other industries, especially those who manage large volumes of potentially sensitive data, learn from this?
Yes, in terms of technology, Ladanna, technology can help detect such incident that appeared in the news and alert the companies much, much faster. Why? Because a company doesn't want to know about the fact a week later, or know from someone else what has happened or how did the news come up. And manually doing this manually, it's impossible. You would need an army to go and online every single day and see what's going on and what's being mentioned on my business partners, my clients, my employees. When you're talking to large organization, they probably deal with 20, 30,000, even more people every year on different purposes. So doing that manually is impossible. And we know how often news evolves, news changes. There could be something on the page 1 of Google today, a couple of days later, it's on the 3rd page, and maybe you missed out on this information. So it's impossible to really keep track of those big volume. So you need something. You need a certain tool. You need a technology. This is definitely where Valital comes in, to filter this information, to provide this alert, so that companies can react quickly. It's not a question of, I would say, calming the storm, but maybe controlling the storm. You want to be in control. And how can you be in control? By having access to the information sooner than everyone else. Because once you have this information, once you're being notified, then you would be able to react. You would be able maybe to restrict access. Maybe in this case, make sure that person is not facing a client the next day or in front of a client the next day. And internally, you want to make sure this news doesn't spread out in your organization, because we know how impactful it can get to the company culture. And we often talk about media monitoring, companies looking what's being mentioned on them, what's being mentioned on their competitor, more on the marketing purpose. But what about the individuals? The individuals represent such a bigger portion. For every company, there's thousands of individuals that are involved in one way or another. So we think that with technology, it's important to have quick access to the information, filter the information, and then you'll go into that thorough analysis, thorough investigation, and take the appropriate decisions accordingly.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Alex and Dawn, as we said, these individuals had some access to client information. One, the financial advisor was opening accounts and so on. So we don't know just how much, but some people believe that, because of the large amount of guns that were found, for example, that he might have been involved with organized crime. We don't know this for a fact, but would you make that assessment? And if yes, what steps would Interfor advise these institutions to take to investigate just how far this might have gone in terms of dealing with organized crime?
Right. So great question. First and foremost, from an investigative standpoint, we have no idea what the full extent of the issues are. And so whether there's an issue with their fiduciary responsibility or whether there's an issue with access they had, first and foremost, we need to determine the true extent of who they are, what the issue is, how extended it is, how endemic it is throughout the entire organization. Were they lone wolves? Was this part of a long-term, drawn-out process where they were planning this from day one, or were they subject to some financial pressures and needed to sell narcotics or deal in weapons? So it's critical from an investigative standpoint to research, investigate, analyze, determine whether they are by themselves, who they're connected to, both inside the company, outside the company, and whether they're being forced to do this or whether they're doing it for themselves for whatever reason. So it's critical to understand how isolated these incidents are or not at all. And that's what an external investigator will do. They will take the time to have these very sensitive inquiries, have the discussions, conduct the field work, look at a lot of the cyber aspects, which we're not really spending much time talking about on this call, but it's critical as well. Who are they communicating with, and to what extent? We're working a case right now that is similar in nature, but the actors are within the company. However, they're being pressured by family members and a criminal ring in another country entirely. So these are the types of things that the local police typically can't do on their own. They don't have the resources, the bandwidth, and they require additional help. And so at the end of the day, you know, as investigators, we're concerned about the reputational risk and also the loss to clients and to the institutions, whereas law enforcement is typically only responsible or concerned about what laws are being broken, how they can prosecute, and how quickly they can get that done. So there is a hand-to-hand kind of responsibility here with a third party. And as we know, people's lives change. You know, you may be a model employee, you may be hired from the best schools, best background, but over years, you know, you're in a nasty divorce, you have a lot of financial pressure, something's happened in your life. So you may be willing to take opportunistic risks. And that's something that usually is not identified quickly. So these things can happen. But if you're conducting ongoing research into employees and their background, whether they're being elevated to a new position, whether it's an annual review, what have you, these are the types of things that may get caught during these processes.
You know, I think from what I'm hearing from all of you, you know, it's not a one and done kind of situation, right? You really have to be, first of all, kind of get a sense to know who your employees are. The bigger you are, the harder it is to sort of get to know everyone, obviously. But I think what I'm hearing is that organizations have to be vigilant. They can't make assumptions about who they're doing business with. They can't make assumptions about the people that they hired many years ago, right? And especially if they're promoting them and so on, you really do need to conduct due diligence and know what you're doing. So that brings us up. That lens actually goes nicely into our second scenario. But before we get there, Danny, I think this is time for us to get our audience involved once again with poll number 2. So do you currently have any system in place to monitor adverse online news about potential business relationships? So yes, we do it manually. Yes, we have an automated platform to help us do this. No, we don't. No, but we're considering it. So go ahead and select your response and we'll take a look at how it pans out. So do we have results? So more people are not. Some equal. Yeah, some are doing it with an automated and some aren't. What do you think about? Does that strike anybody as interesting?
Well, I feel at least at this point, it proves that, you know, some organizations are seeing the greater picture and some are still figuring it out. And I think that's, you know, that's par for the course.
So let's look at our second scenario here. Again, we've, you know, have an amalgamation of a couple of incidents that a number of you are probably familiar with. So unlike the example that we looked at before, these next cases involve online behavior that was there for the you know, the employers to see, the organizations to be aware of, and it shouldn't have come as a surprise to them given who they are. So it's one thing for small companies to get this stuff wrong, right? They're not well resourced, but quite another for very large, very well-known, very reputable, well-resourced brands to be in the dark about what their people are up to, especially their senior people. So many in our audience might recall the Twitter incidents that took place a couple of years ago with Major League Baseball involving a couple of their star players. In both incidents, the same Twitter user, we don't know why, but the same user dug up and reposted old tweets both major leaguers had posted years before. And in one instance, somebody was quite young when he posted certain things. So we're talking about, you know, some gay slurs, jokes with racist undertones, just not very pleasant stuff. And the two players and the MLB obviously had a lot of cleaning up to do because they were mired in controversy for a couple of weeks. And then in this separate other incident. It just happened last week, and I think most people are probably even more shocked by this. Google had to remove on January 2nd, they had to remove Kamal Bob, their global lead for diversity strategy and research, from his post because of anti-Semitic blog posts that he made back in 2007. And he had been in the role for nearly 3 years. Needless to say, his deeply offensive writings sparked global outrage, and I think we can say is still sparking global outrage. So let's start with you here, Mark, because we've put the two things together. So let's separate out the MLB Twitter incident. At first glance, this looks like a straightforward example of reputation risk to the MLB brand. It's a little bit embarrassing. It's disappointing, but it just looks like a reputation risk. But I wonder, given just how passionate sports fans are, and all of the emotions that are involved in going to the stadium and following sports, could this have become a security risk matter as well? And if yes, how so?
I think it does. I mean, again, for Major League Baseball, they're dealing with this from a brand issue, but from a security perspective, these are high-profile people. They have people that look up to them. They have people that listen to what they have to say. And when it comes to to race, religion, religious belief, sexual preference, I mean, these are all triggers for people. And when somebody puts something out there that's inappropriate, concerning, who's reading that when it goes out there, and what is their reaction to it? And and then that's what I think we have to think about here is it may not have been the intent of those who put it up there. And again, we don't know if it was driven by hate, it was driven by just being ignorant. We don't know what their intent is, but what they're not aware of is that it's going to drive other people to potentially take it beyond that. And they feel encouraged and they feel enabled because, somebody that they look up to and that they, have a high regard for is out there saying this type of thing. And they're saying, well, if they can do it, why can't I do it? And they might take it to another level. And that's what I've often seen is when you see those type of comments, you just have, people, whether they have mental health issues or just plain hateful, they come out of the woodwork and they react to that stuff. And that's, I think, what we have to pay attention to.
That's a really good point, and such a lesson for all of us to learn, I think, about being so careful about what we say and do online, right? And the more elevated you are, just even more so about being careful. And I think Alex, again, as I said, it's particularly shocking to those of us to learn that these brands, with a wealth of resources at their fingertips, were caught off guard by their employees' old online behavior. The Google incident especially is troubling because of his role as their diversity leader, right? Head of diversity and inclusion. So what should the MLB and Google have done to mitigate these incidents? Could they have done a better job in pre-hire due diligence? And if so, is it a one and done thing?
Absolutely. In terms of those cases, I think most of us heard them because they involve major institutions. They involve the Major League Baseball. They involve the big company like Google. But I'm sure everyone here has ran into a tweet, saw someone tweet certain discrimination or certain remarks that maybe did not belong on the internet. And people today, unfortunately, are way too vocal online. They're putting their opinions out there, sometimes with racist remarks, sometimes not in a respectful way. I think we're more in front of our computer than ever before now, particularly with this remote work, with the pandemic. So people are really online and putting things, I would say, out there. And the whole thing, how companies should react, is that for a long time, they were used to a traditional background check. And a traditional background check at pre-hire, you're looking into the criminal records, you're looking into the credit check. But now, with the internet being so open, with those different platforms existing, the media aspect and the media component of someone's present or of an individual as a whole is critical. It's important to know what's being mentioned either about them or what they're mentioning, like, for example, this case at Google and the Major League Baseball, because those things can be as damaging, if not more, than a criminal record. There are chances that you don't have a criminal record, but maybe you're a suspect in a certain case. And I think as someone who's doing business with you or your employer, I would want to be aware of those things. I don't want to learn them 2-3 months down the line. And in the case of Google, I think those things have been brought up 10 years later, and there are big chances that some people probably internally were aware of this or saw this blog, saw this tweet, and it creates this kind of friction internally that you don't want inside your organization. So initially in your pre-hire, this is a component that is more and more, and we've seen companies more and more request the media component as part of their due diligence when hiring someone. Now, in terms of doing it continuously, that depends on the type of industry, depends on the role of the person. If that person is client facing, then maybe you want to get an alert if that person is going to tweet certain remarks like those. So I think the continuous aspect could be on a case-by-case basis, but at least doing it once. When you're bringing that person on board, you want to make sure that you have the full picture of the individual.
That makes complete sense. Once again, it's just really being mindful and being aware as an employer, as an organization. Again, as we, in these instances, we're talking about employees, but again, let's be mindful. We're talking about any business stakeholder here, really. What they do can impact your business, your reputation, and expose you to a great deal of risks. So Don, Alex talked about pre-hire due diligence and the need for organizations to check for adverse online news about people they plan to do business with. In this case, as we said, it's employees, but this applies to any and all business relationships. So tell me how Interfor would come at this, particularly the Google case, from an investigative standpoint. Is there even more that organizations can do when it comes to due diligence?
So absolutely. First of all, I agree with Mark and Alex entirely. From our perspective, proper due diligence is just like good insurance. I mean, you hope you never need to use it, but if something occurs, then you're glad you have it, right? So quite frankly, this is the type of thing, especially in the Google scenario, something we would have caught in a pre-hire due diligence. Even though it was years before, 10 years, 15 years, the way we approach these scenarios is applying something called a reputation check. And to Alex's point, whether you had a criminal record or not, these days, a lot of it's Googleable. A lot of it is depending on which country and jurisdiction you operate in, but a lot of it is publicly available to a certain extent. So, and we're putting privacy rules and regulations aside for this discussion, but for us, it's whether this individual will have a negative impact on, on the reputation of the firm or organization. That is often more critical than anything else. Let's take a step back and think about just the Me Too movement, right? Which exploded on the scene a couple of years ago. That had, in our perspective, more of an impact as far as a risk and reputational risk and risk in general to organizations than some physical security risks. So whether someone had a criminal record is one thing, but whether they had a Me Too infraction, that could be exponentially more explosive than simply, whether they were involved in some sort of litigation or had a criminal record. So the assessment and analysis component of it is critical. And that's something that, while the AI systems are great at catching the mentions and the information out there and can churn a lot of it, specifically analyzing, putting that analysis perspective, the human analysis perspective, as to whether something is a risk to an organization, really comes down to the skill, the expertise, and the training of the analyst. And that's something that is not a digital component. It's not something that can be done via AI for the most part. It's something that an experienced investigator will look at and say, okay, this person had a run-in, this person had a criminal infraction, this person had said or did something. Knowing the organization that we're working for, how important would this be? How explosive would this be? And I will say, for someone especially on the Google side, someone openly writing about anti-Semitic or making anti-Semitic remarks, that is someone, when I'm looking to hire them or elevate them to the head of diversity, I mean, that's a non-starter to begin with. That's something that wouldn't even, that's not even a difficult decision, but that is a reflection of, it requires human ingenuity. It requires skill and perspective to make that decision. And, quite frankly, it's up to companies these days to analyze whether the risks and the issues that they're dealing with, whether they're current or in the past, are relevant to them. So, you know, as we all know, society changes and things change over time. So things that were accepted 15 years ago in an organization may not be accepted today. So someone has to analyze that, and there needs to be a decision tree and a process to look at those threats and determine whether, you know, do we care about this today? And if so, how are we going to handle that? How are we going to mitigate the reputational risks and the security risks? So that's something that an investigator needs to do.
I think you make an incredible point here, Dawn, and the rest of you have mentioned it as well, is, you know, as a society, you know, what we tolerate changes, right? And so in many instances, there are things that people got away with that they are no longer able to do. And it's not to say that, you know, it's not about holding things against people, but organizations do have to make that assessment. Is this something we can tolerate? Or are we aware of it enough so that if it comes out, we are prepared to be able to deal with that incident? And in these instances, it doesn't seem as though anyone was prepared, right, to be able to deal with it. It just sort of came in like a flood, really. And I think that's what it is that we're trying to say is you have ample opportunity to get that intel, to gather the intelligence that you need. And then it's up to you as an organization. How do you want to deal with that? So I think that's a good, by the way, you use the word Googleable, Dawn, and I thought I've never heard that before. So that I'm going to have to add that to my vocabulary.
It's become an adverb, a verb, an adjective. It's become everything these days.
That's fantastic. So I think it's time now, Danny, we can go into our third poll and get a sense of where our audience sits on this question. So how can continuous monitoring of online media boost your risk mitigation process? Do you think it can definitely enhance your response to risk? It may be helpful, but isn't critical, and is not of much value to your processes. So let us know what you think about continuous monitoring of online media. So we'll give you a second more to vote. And Danny, do you have a sense of where we stand with that?
Oh,
Okay, that's good to see.
well, that's clear.
Yeah, yeah. No, not a value to our pros. Good. That's what we want to see. 0% on that one. So we're gonna go into our final real world case study, and this is one that everybody on the planet knows about, but we're going to look at it from a little bit of a different perspective here. So it's about, you know, the Capitol insurrection, right? You're all familiar with what happened with the storming of the U.S. Capitol building on January 6th, but we want to look at it as a cautionary tale of what happens when you have an overflow of publicly available data and pertinent signs are missed because they're drowned out in all of the noise around you. There was a mountain of social media communications and chatter amongst the members of wide-ranging groups, from those who wanted peace, those who didn't want peace, so from a wide range, lots of chatter. So what we're going to do now is address some of the what ifs, okay? So what if certain tripwires had been set around violent terminology that would have sent an alert to investigate those individual cases more closely? What if companies had certain monitors in place to see if their employees or counterparts were involved with violent fringe groups, for example? When you have cutting edge tools set to monitor for certain triggers, you then get actionable data that's sifted out of what we would call a tsunami of inputs, right? Then the investigative arms of the authorities and corporate security departments have what they need to look into. What if these companies had been monitoring for those associations on an ongoing basis? Many of them had to fire people or cut ties with stakeholders because of the reputational damage that it would have brought, right? What if these companies had been monitoring for those associations on an ongoing basis? And it wasn't only companies, but municipal services and several police departments thrown in for good measure. So Mark, again here, you have an illustrious career in this particular space from a threat management perspective. How beneficial would it have been to get early warning about this in advance? And how can we work with the intelligence from such an internal warning system? Can you share your thoughts on January 6th as it pertains to this specific topic here?
Thank you. Yeah, clearly, based on the survey you just took, I mean, I think it's 90% of people that are joining us here, do believe that that this is a good way to mitigate risk. What we talked about before at the beginning, we talked about decision making. We talked about the partnership of AI along with human intelligence. In any type of situation, you want to be able to get as much information as you can to make that appropriate decision about what you're going to do to manage the risk. You want to determine what the threats are. You want to determine what your gaps or what your vulnerabilities are, and what type of risk are you facing as a result of what those vulnerabilities are, and what your gaps are, and how do you fill those. And you determine what do we need for people, what do we need from technology, what do we need for physical barriers, what can we do to prevent this from happening, as opposed to having to react to it. But if we are going to have to react to it, how is that going to be planned out? How are we going to set up our communication? But it all comes down to again, just coming up with the appropriate information to be able to come up with the appropriate risk management plan, and be able to make sure, as they say, to detect and to deter, and to make sure that harmful things don't happen.
Mhm.
And so Alex, if again, hindsight being what it is, 2020, what would an employer or a law enforcement agency using an AI system like Valital's, for example, have done in a situation like this?
Yeah, well, to add on to what Mark said, this goes back also to what we mentioned before. People are vocal and people change. And as an organization who's doing business with someone, or who has an employee, or a law enforcement agency who has certain people in my team, I need to know my people. And I need to know my people as much as I could. And in such a situation, when you have a system like Valital, where we use AI is really to detect this type of content, whether it's violence, whether it's discrimination, like we've heard in the previous cases. In this case, it's people who are encouraging or talking about violence. And the fact that you could get an alert quickly of an event that may happen, or someone that you may have hired a couple of years ago or have brought in a couple of years ago, and there was nothing on that person. And now suddenly, over the past couple of months, they're starting to put certain ideas out there or certain content out there encouraging those type of actions. Now, as an organization, and using a tool like Valital would help you get those alerts, help you monitor this type of information that comes in, new information that comes in, that's publicly available information that you receive and you want to have. And if you were to do this manually, if you were to have several people looking at thousands of individuals that you're working with, it's clear that you may miss out on some information, or it may cost you a lot in terms of human labor, if you want. Now, what you want to do with it, now it goes back to probably more specialized into Don and Mark and their team. It's in terms of how are we going to investigate further? Because those kind of things can have a tremendous impact, not just to the company's reputation or the law enforcement agency, but society as a whole, because you're looking and you're seeing people you're working with that are encouraging certain actions. So I think that being able to get access to this information that's filtered for you, afterwards you want to go investigate further, or even maybe in this case notify the authorities, then definitely it's a great action to take on and to mitigate your risk as a company.
That rolls up nicely into what, Dawn, your perspectives on this, because after receiving alerts, we're talking about monitoring and receiving alerts, what can a company then do with the information? What are the implications?
Right, it's a great question. I mean, first and foremost, we now know, it's now perfectly clear and apparent that much of the discussions, planning and organizational machinations occurred weeks in advance. And a lot of it was done openly, surprisingly and shockingly openly, open media, open communication, open social media. The writing was on the wall well before January 6th. So, a company shouldn't wait until the last minute to realize that they have a problem. So if they've gotten an early alert, if a system picked up that there is this chatter on planning, it's up to a company to determine whether, are we dealing with a church group going to exercise their constitutional rights, or are we dealing with oath keepers, 3%ers, Proud Boys, or negative actors and bad actors who are planning something, either criminal or leading up to criminal activity. So, it's critical that companies have a process and procedure in place to manage their public and private cooperation. So what I mean by that is you don't want to wait until an emergency to figure out who you need to call and what you need to tell them and how you investigate and package that information for law enforcement. So it goes without saying, a lot of the early alerts should have been relayed to law enforcement, and I'm referring to corporate interactions and companies that had to deal with these things. And we've heard stories of CEOs being fired by their boards, or board members being fired by their boards, or, key executives of, Fortune 500 companies having to be separated from their companies due to their activities on January 6th or leading up to it. So first and foremost, a corporate security department, an investigative group, an intelligence group within an organization, or their third-party investigators should have initially understood what's being said, how it's being said, to what extent, and then analyzing and assessing the extent of the problem. And then the decision tree needs to be activated to determine what is being done about it, or what should be done about it, which could lead from everything from an internal sanction involving HR, involving legal, all the way to compiling the information and disseminating it to law enforcement. And that whole process can't be created on the 1 yard line during an incident. It needs to be developed well in advance and tested and proven and tested time and time and again. So a threat assessment needed to have occurred internally within organizations once they identify these issues. And that threat assessment is looking at the interactions, looking at the social media posts, looking at the publicly available information, and determining the extent of the problem, and then determining what should we do with this information. And that whole life cycle involves early notification, investigative services, and also the threat management aspect of it. So, unfortunately, the ball was dropped many times over leading up to January 6th. A lot of companies have egg on their face, and even worse, and some liability because of all of this. And ultimately, it comes down to proper investigative support, research, proactive communication, and interacting with the public-private network, if you will.
So I really think that, from this the conversation that we've had, I think you've all sort of really laid the case for why it's so important to make sure there's a lot of information out there. You need technology to help you gather that intelligence. And as I like to say, technology is there to serve us. we're not there to serve technology, it's there to serve us. So it plays its role in gathering intelligence, but we also need to use our judgment. We also need to go in and decipher, understand what it means, get the right people to analyze, and make the right decisions about when to be calling in folks like Don and Mark, and when Alex's, tools like Alex's, the Valital should be used. So I think you've really sort of laid the case very, very soundly here for why it's important to bring human intelligence and artificial intelligence together to help assess, detect, and mitigate risk. So I'm going to pause there. I think, Danny, we've got some questions from our guest. This is great because we actually went up right to the right amount of time. So this is fantastic. So there is a question that's come in. Don, Alex, or Mark, go ahead and field this one. It says that, when you're looking at post-hiring, after you've hired an employee, looking for issues is like looking for a needle in a haystack. How do you do this if you're a big company?
Right. Well, I'll jump in from the investigative standpoint, because I think working hand in hand with Valital is the perfect cycle. Initially, an organization needs to, step one, determine what are red flags. And that can be done in conjunction with HR, with legal, with compliance, with all the disparate groups in large organizations or small, and determine what are issues that we should be flagging and looking out for. Once you do that, then it's a matter of determining what tools we have in our cupboard to help identify and find these red flags, whether it is Valital looking for publicly available media, whether it's keyword searches on email systems, whether it's various different technical red flag assessment tools that companies deploy into their internet, into their intranets, internet, and also some of their communication systems and their own internal technology. All that goes into play, and then what you do with that is the next step, and that's really dependent upon the corporation, the entity itself. If you are a financial institution, any indications of fraud around financial improprieties, any fraud along those lines, is obviously critical for you. If you're in education, any indications of impropriety around dealing with students or sexual malfeasance or anything along those lines will be obviously a red flag for you. So it really depends on what kind of organization you are, where you are, and what you're allowed to legally do as far as ongoing vetting of the employee base.
Yeah, and maybe to add on, those are great points from Don, but it's also a question what you're looking for. And those are often public information that probably anyone in your organization or external people can probably have access to. So it's important that you, as the person who's working directly with that person, or who's, I would say, controlling this access, I would say, would have access to the information much sooner than anyone else. Now, we'll always say, don't bring in a technology tool and think that that tool will take the decision for you. That will never be the case, and that should never be the case. Technology will filter information, will make sure you're not missing out on some information that's out there that's maybe too crowded because of so much media, so much fake news. So you get this filtering, but afterwards, don't let it take the decision. Use, I would say, the people internally and your policies, and again, the role, the industry, which are good points that Don raised, to make the decision and to take the appropriate action.
Mark, do you have anything to add before we move on to the next question?
Not much other than I just am seeing just so many more people now, both for post-hire and for pre-hire and then post-hire, just getting so much more into social media and looking to see what their employees are saying out there. And I think it's really surprising to people what they are finding. Some of the things we talked about before, whether it be homophobic, whether it be anti-Semitic, whether it be race, they're just finding a lot of different issues out there that people have in their history, and you can tell a lot from how somebody's thinking by what they're saying. And I do agree with Don as far as on the levels. I mean, you have to look at what levels. I think you have to take a hard look. One size does not fit as far as what you do for these updates. And if people do have, connectivity to your financial systems, you want to be taking a really hard look at them, credit reports, and to see, are they in debt? Just what is their financial status? Because again, these insider threats with the finances can go on. I've seen it in financial institutions where it's gone for 1, 2, 3 years because of, the ability of these people to go undetected because everybody trusted them.
No, that's a really good point. There is, you kind of touched on it a little bit, Don, Alex, around privacy, and I think I want to bring this up more to the fore because I suspect a lot of people, are sort of wondering, can I, is everything going to be used against me? And Jed, where are you getting this information from? Like, we all make mistakes. So what are the ethical or privacy related implications of monitoring individuals? Can you be clear about that?
Right. So this is the big question, right? And I think that it's very sticky, and we're in a gray area right now in many ways. But at the end of the day, it depends on the jurisdiction and the industry you're in. And so, as we know, our seat of government for our companies here in New York City has very, very stringent rules around pre-hire, what you can legally do during pre-hire background checks, ongoing background checks, due diligence investigations. It's very constrained and constricted. So you first and foremost need to figure out through inside counsel or outside counsel what you're legally allowed to do in your organization and in your region. Secondly, the question is, there is the question of ethics, and there's also the question of, quite frankly, what's right and wrong for just as the human race. If you made a mistake 30 years ago as a child or as a young adult or even as a new adult, and should that follow you for the rest of your life? Now, the answer is it depends on what you did and where you work, from my perspective. So if you did something, if you've committed a crime or said something stupid, well, let's use the Google case. If you made anti-Semitic remarks and you wrote a whole position paper on anti-Semitism or that expounded anti-Semitic remarks, should you be the head of diversity for a globally recognized firm? I don't think so, but it all depends on what's legally accessible or allowed in your organization or your area. And also, quite frankly, what the litmus test is for your organization. So I think it's a balance, and we should treat it on a case-by-case basis.
Alex, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think it depends really on the jurisdiction. So if you go to Quebec, for example, in Canada, we have some financial institutions. They were doing the background check initially at hire. Then they started putting it in place every 5 years. And now for some cases, they want to do it more regularly on a yearly basis. So I guess it depends also on the legal implications for that. But definitely, for example, the background check is being done much more often than before. It's a case by case, like Don mentioned. If 10 years ago there was information on you with marijuana, maybe it was a problem. Now it's pretty much legal almost across certain states in the US and in Canada. So it really depends on the case. At least you have access to the information, but we're seeing it done much more frequently than at pre-hire. And then after, it's internally in terms of the legal counsel, what they can do with it and how often they can do it.
Well, I can tell you about, that marijuana being legal in Canada. I run every morning, and I tell you, there are certain spots where I just smell it all, and I'm like, this is a different world we live in now. So we have another question here that says, should you investigate internally or outside?
Sounds like the question is whether you should be doing it yourself or engaging with third parties. And so this is, the rule of thumb, and I'm not saying this just because we're, a third party investigative agency. I'm saying this because it's a combination of both. Does a company have its own investigative resources internally? Some do, many don't. There's also limits as to what you can do as an employer. So it's often the case, and I think the most advisable, depending on the type of incident, to bring in a third party, an outside investigative resource, for a couple of reasons. One, we tend to have the best tools, the best capabilities, and really, quite frankly, the most experience dealing with a lot of the issues that an organization is facing. And two, if we're conducting these inquiries through outside counsel or inside counsel, that's legal counsel, a lot of the work is protected, and a lot of the work is we're guided by the legal minds of the organization and outside counsel. So we can then help formulate a mitigation strategy or remediation. So we want to be able to take our information and do something with it. So are we removing or separating an employee from the organization, or are we, recommending criminal, prosecution? If it's done externally, we have more bandwidth and more room to operate, and we can do things that, quite frankly, internal employees of a company cannot do. And we're, obviously licensed, bonded, and insured in a variety of jurisdictions, which gives us more leeway. And a lot of the cases today tend to have international nexus, right? So if you commit, a lot of these internal frauds involve, third-party banks, foreign jurisdictions, compatriots in the Far East. So we need to be able to investigate and stretch our investigative legs, which you typically can't do from within an organization.
So we got a couple more minutes left, and there's one question that I think is worth asking, because you touched on this, Alex, when you said, there's financial institutions, they used to do it every year, then every 5 years. And at what point should companies be doing a renewed background check on existing employees? I mean, do you have certain recommendations around that? Mark, Don, Alex, any one of you jump in?
I think a lot of it depends on, what does that company do? Look at the people that are involved. Are there some people that maybe you have to do it yearly? Are there other people maybe every 3 years? Other people, other 5 years? Executive the C-suite employees, how often do you do it with them? So I think, again, I think this is something where you have to talk to your HR, your general counsel, and you have to figure out, what works best for your company. And a lot of this too is going to be dependent on, what's the past history? What do you evaluate as your greatest threats? How much access to people have? And as I think both Don and Alex have mentioned before, what type of things are already ongoing, that hopefully are going to detect, bad behavior, both from a technology perspective and from a human observation perspective. So I don't think there's any one size that fits all for everybody. And I think they have to figure out what's going to work out best for them. But I do think the bottom line is you can't just rely on that initial background that you do and have an employee who's been there for 20 or 25 years and not have them go through some event in their life that potentially is going to change them from what they were when they entered on duty with your organization.
Yeah, I think that's prudent. One size doesn't fit all, and it really does depend. So I think I promised all our guests here that we would have an engaging conversation. I think we delivered. Do you guys feel like you delivered? I think we delivered on that. So this was fantastic. And as I said, there's so much to talk about when it comes to, strategic risk around reputation and other things, right? We've touched on some other threats and so on that businesses face. So look out for more from us, but immediately, we are going to send you out a link for the video on demand, so you can catch this conversation again in case you missed anything, and you can share it widely with your colleagues and with your network. So Mark, Don, Alex, thank you very much. And we've come to the end of our webinar. Thank you everyone who joined us.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Ladanna. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good day.
Thanks.